The next step after cleaning comes the sanding. Wait until any water on the cabinets has dried until you sand. The sander we use is called a surf prep. Turn on the machine by pressing the power button. You can see that the surf prep is super sensitive and has accurate control when you press the button on top. There are multiple power levels, although I always leave it on the highest. Before you attach your sandpaper, be sure to put this on. It's called a pad saver, and it increases the life of the red pad on the surf prep. The sandpaper can then stick on top of the pad saver. Let's go over the different grits of sandpaper we use on the surf prep. 180 is used on the cabinets to prepare them before the primer. Being a little rougher, it scuffs up the surface well to aid with adhesion. 320 is the finer one, and we use that on paint to smooth it out before the final coat. The surf prep can also be used with these thicker pads. You can see that they are squishy. Different pads have different amount of firmness to them. There are also different thicknesses to these pads. These pads are useful for curved or detailed areas of cabinet as they squish and contour to the surface, getting all the areas that a normal sandpaper couldn't. These pads don't use grits. Instead, we have medium, which is equivalent to 180, and superfine, which is equivalent to 320. While there are many other grits available from Surf Prep, these are usually the ones we buy. Sometimes you may want to sand by hand if you need to access detailed areas or use a lot of control, such as when sanding filler. You can see that I take a full sheet of sandpaper, and then either by folding and ripping or using a knife, I divide it into quarters. This gives you an easy to use and manageable piece. You can then wrap the quarter of sandpaper around a sanding block like this to sand flat surfaces with a lot of accuracy. As the square of sandpaper gets worn down, you can move the block along to make use of all the sandpaper. To keep the jobs cost effective and efficient, we try not to waste any sandpaper. Let's go over some more different grits. When sanding by hand, you typically want to use a higher grit than you would with an electric sander. So this 180 here is a lot coarser than the 180 we had on the surf prep. I would normally only use this for removing material such as a bad coat of paint or really rough damaged wood that needs to be sanded down. 320 grit when sanding by hand would be a closer equivalent to the 180 we used on the surf prep. So I would use this to prepare the wood before priming. This can be very useful for awkward areas that you just can't get the electric sander into, as you'll see later. I also would typically use this grit for sanding down filler. Sometimes we will also carry 220 grit, which can be used pretty interchangeably with 320. Finally, we have this 600 here. 600 is a very fine sandpaper used for smoothing off the paint before the final coat. It's equivalent to the 320 when used on the electric sander. Here you can see me using the surf prep on the cabinets to prepare for the priming after the cleaning. Because of its square shape, it can fit right into the corners like this. Notice how I'm just moving side to side in a steady, even motion, rather than scrubbing back and forth as you would when sanding by hand. There's no need to move quickly with an electric sander. The vibrations will do the work for you. Also, press firmly but not very hard, just enough to keep the machine on the surface. Note that we don't actually want to be removing material when we're sanding in preparation. We're just scuffing the surface up to aid with the adhesion. Small scratches in the surface caused by the sandpaper helps the paint cling to the surface better. Occasionally you may want to sand the surface down if it's very rough from water damage, for example, but normally we're just lightly scuffing it. On front edges like this, I just use the end of the pad and push lightly. You don't want to wrap around and sand the edges off, as this could cause the veneer on the front face to peel off. Keep the machine flat on the surface. I am careful to use the edge of the sanding pad only, not going up and onto the tape, as this could rip the masking. Sometimes, for incised edges such as this, you may find it easier to just sand by hand. Here I'm using a square of 320 grit sandpaper folded in half. You can see I move up and down quickly and go over the surface lots of times to ensure it's scuffed up enough. You may have to push back the masking tape a little bit if it's in the way. Notice that I'm using just the corner of the sandpaper here so that I don't accidentally rip the plastic. Here we have a primed, unprepared surface. As you can see, when I scratch it, the primer comes off. This is unacceptable. In this example, the surface has been sanded and degreased. As you can see, the primer adheres much better. This is the kind of quality we are looking for. All of our projects are under a 2-year adhesion warranty, so if there's any issues, we have to go back and fix them, and the company loses lots of money. We obviously don't want to have to do this, so it's super important to prepare everything correctly. Some areas you want to clean especially well are nearby the stove here, as they get extra greasy from people's cooking. Also, along the toe kicks. Toe kicks are these strips along the floor under the cabinets. Toe kicks are super important to be thorough on, as not only do they tend to be dirtier to begin with, being so close to the floor, but they will receive extra wear from people's toes, kicking. I've noticed that some people like to skimp out on areas along the floor, as they involve crawling around and are hard to get to. Please do not do this. Everything, even the tricky bits, need to be prepared thoroughly and completely. I really can't emphasize this enough.